On December 13, 1978, a Des Plaines police officer stepped into the home of a respected local contractor and smelled something he could not explain. It was not gas. It was not sewage. It was the smell of decomposition seeping up through the floorboards of a suburban house on West Somerdale Avenue. The homeowner was John Wayne Gacy, a 36-year-old businessman who had shaken hands with a first lady and performed at children's hospitals dressed as Pogo the Clown. How does a man like that end up connected to a missing 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest? The first search of that house turned up nothing incriminating. It took investigators 9 more days and a second warrant to understand what was really under the floor. In this episode, we walk through 3 searches, 2 confessions, and 1 crawl space that would eventually give up 29 human bodies, plus 4 more found elsewhere. Detail number 3 is the one that still unsettles the officers who were there. If you follow cases like this, subscribe. We cover a new one every week. To understand what happened in that house, you first have to understand the man who owned it. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942, the middle child of 3, and the only son of a Danish-Polish father who drank heavily and a mother who tried to shield her children from him. Neighbors would later describe Gacy as a boy who worked hard, wanted to please, and never seemed to earn his father's approval. He had a heart condition as a child that kept him from sports. He dropped out of high school, he moved to Las Vegas briefly, worked in a mortuary, then came back to Illinois, finished business school, and married a co-worker named Marlon Myers in 1964. By the late 1960s, he was managing 3 Kentucky fried chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, that belonged to his father-in-law. He was a JC, a community volunteer, and by all outward measures, a rising young businessman. That first life ended in 1968, when Gacy was charged in Iowa with the sodomy of a teenage employee. He was sentenced to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. He served 18 months. His wife divorced him while he was inside. When he was paroled in 1970, he moved back to the Chicago area, in with his mother, and started over. In 1971, he bought the house that would define the rest of his life and the lives of dozens of families. 82113 West Somerdale Avenue, in an unincorporated pocket of Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago. It was a modest, single-story ranch house with an attached garage and a crawl space beneath the floor. He started a construction company he called PDM Contractors, painting, decorating, and maintenance. He hired young men, many of them teenagers, to work for him. He married again in 1972 to a woman named Carol Hoff, who moved in with her 2 daughters. She would later tell investigators about strange odors in the house and about the young male employees who came and went at all hours. They divorced in 1976. From that point on, Gacy lived alone. Publicly, he became a fixture of local Democratic politics in the Norwood Park precinct. He organized the Polish Constitution Day parade. He was photographed in 1978 with First Lady Rosalind Carter wearing an S-pin that indicated a Secret Service security clearance he had somehow been granted for the event. He performed at charity events and children's parties as 2 characters he had created, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He would later say something chilling in an interview that a clown can get away with murder. But in 1975, 1976, 1977, and into 1978, nobody in his neighborhood was thinking that. They were thinking he threw good summer parties, that he tipped well, that he was the kind of man who plowed your driveway when it snowed. And underneath all of that, young men were disappearing from the Chicago area. Not vanishing dramatically. Vanishing quietly. Runaways. Bus station kids. Boys with troubled home lives who were not always reported missing right away, and when they were often written off as having simply left town. Timothy McCoy, 16 years old, disappeared in January 1972. John Butkovich, 17, an employee of PDM, disappeared in July 1975. His parents told police that Gacy owed him money and had been the last person to see him. Detectives interviewed Gacy. He was polite, cooperative, and unhelpful. Nothing came of it. Darrell Sampson, Randall Reffett, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll, Rick Johnston, Kenneth Parker, Michael Marino. In 1976 and 1977, the pace increased. Some were PDM employees, some were hitchhikers picked up on Chicago's north side, some were young men Gacy met near the Greyhound bus terminal downtown. In almost every case, when detectives eventually did knock on the door of 82113 West Summerdale, John Wayne Gacy shook their hands, invited them in, and told a plausible story. And in almost every case, they left. The wall of that story finally cracked on December 11, 1978. A 15-year-old high school sophomore named Robert Peist worked part-time at a Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. That evening, he told his mother, who was waiting for him in the store to pick him up after his shift, that a contractor had offered him a job that paid better, and he was going out to the parking lot to talk to him. He said he would be right back. He never came back. Elizabeth Peist was not a woman who could be brushed off. She and her husband went straight to the Des Plaines police that same night. The pharmacy owner remembered the contractor's name. It was John Gacy. When Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchak ran the name, the 1968 Iowa sodomy conviction came up. That single detail is what saved the case, because it meant Gacy could not be treated as a normal witness. He was, from that first night, a person of interest. On December 13, 1978, Des Plaines detectives went to the house on West Summerdale with a search warrant. It was narrow. They were looking for signs of Robert Peist. Gacy was hostile, then charming, then hostile again. He was taken in for questioning while officers walked through the house. In the crawl space, they smelled something they couldn't quite identify. Gacy insisted it was sewage from a broken drain. They took items from the house: a class ring engraved with the initials JAS, photographs, driver's licenses that did not belong to Gacy, handcuffs, a syringe, a piece of 2x4 with holes drilled in it, and pieces of clothing too small to be his. The ring turned out to belong to John A. Sake, a 19-year-old who had disappeared in 1977. Gacy had been driving Sake's car. And still at that moment, investigators did not have a body. What they did next was unusual, and it is the part of this story that reads more like siege than police work. Because the first search had not produced enough for an arrest on murder, but it had produced more than enough to make everyone nervous, the Des Plaines police put John Wayne Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. 2 unmarked cars in shifts everywhere he went. He noticed immediately. And what he did in response is one of the most bizarre stretches in American crime history. Instead of hiding, he invited the surveillance officers to dinner. He invited them for breakfast at a pancake house. He drove them all over Chicago in his black Oldsmobile, sometimes at high speed, sometimes crawling through traffic. He was drinking heavily. He was falling apart. And on December 20th, in the office of his lawyer, according to attorneys Sam Amarante and Leroy Stevens, he told them he had killed around 30 people, that the bodies were in the crawl space of his house, and that one of them was Robert Peist. His lawyers, bound by privilege, did not go to the police. They did not have to. Gacy was going to give himself away. Here is the detail that still troubles the officers who were there, the one promised at the start. When the second warrant was executed on December 20, 1978, and Detective Daniel Genty crawled beneath the house with a flashlight, the crawl space was already partially flooded with lime and groundwater. He dug down about a foot. He saw what he first thought was a tree root. It was a human arm bone. He backed out and radioed up. But what the officers on that scene remember, the thing that comes up in interviews decades later, is not the first body. It is the moment they realize the entire crawl space was structured. Gacy had divided the ground beneath his house into a grid. There were trenches. There were rows. He had run out of room. In one of his statements to police, he described how, by 1978, he was stacking bodies on top of each other, and how, because he had no more space in the crawl space, he had begun dumping his last victims off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Robert Peist was one of those last 4. His body was recovered from the river in April 1979. Over the following weeks, from December 1978 into the spring of 1979, evidence technicians from the Cook County Sheriff's Police and forensic anthropologists, including Dr. Clyde Snow, worked in the crawl space in shifts because it was physically brutal. The ceiling was low. The air was foul. They removed the floor of the house entirely. They recovered 29 bodies from the property, 26 in the crawl space, one under the concrete of the garage, one under the concrete of the recreation room, and one under the driveway. 4 more victims were pulled from the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers. In total, 33 young men and boys, aged 14 to 21, were tied to John Wayne Gacy. 9 of them would remain unidentified for decades. Some are still being identified today through DNA work led by the Cook County Sheriff's Office, which reopened the identification project in 2011. As of the most recent public updates, 6 of the original victims remain unnamed. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978. He was indicted on 33 counts of murder. His trial began in Chicago on February 6, 1980, before Judge Louis Garippo. The prosecution was led by Cook County State's Attorney William Kunkel. The defense, led by Sam Amarante, did not deny that Gacy had killed. They could not. The bodies were under his house. Instead, they mounted an insanity defense, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and could not control his actions. Psychiatric experts on both sides testified. The jury heard from surviving witnesses, including young men who had escaped Gacy's house, who described being handcuffed, choked with a rope, tightened by a wooden handle, the so-called rope trick, and left for dead. On March 13, 1980, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted John Wayne Gacy on all 33 counts. He was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois. He gave interviews. He painted, often self-portraits of himself as Pogo the Clown, and sold the paintings. He gave contradictory accounts of the killings, sometimes admitting them, sometimes blaming an alternate personality he called Jack Hanley, sometimes claiming employees of PDM had done it. He never provided a full, reliable list of names. That silence is one reason the identification of victims has taken so long. On May 10, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center. His last recorded words, according to witnesses, were profane and dismissive. He was 52 years old. The house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue was demolished in April 1979, only months after the last body was removed. A new house was later built on the lot, with a different address, because the neighborhood did not want the old one to exist even on paper. But the case did not end with the demolition, and it did not end with the execution. In 2011, then Cook County Sheriff Thomas Dart announced that his office would exhume the remains of the 8 victims who were still unidentified at the time and attempt to match them with DNA from families of missing young men from the 1970s. That project has so far identified William George Bundy, James Byron Hykinson, and Francis Wayne Alexander. Their families, in some cases, had spent more than 40 years not knowing. The sheriff's office has also used the DNA database to answer other cold cases entirely, matching profiles to men who disappeared in the 1970s but were never Gacy victims. The tip line remains open. What is left after all of that is a case that is technically solved and emotionally not. We know who did it, we know how many, we know in broad strokes how. What we do not fully know is why so many warnings were missed. John Butkovich's parents told police in 1975 that Gacy was the last person to see their son alive. Gregory Godzik disappeared in December 1976 after telling friends his boss, Gacy, had him digging trenches in the crawl space of the Summerdale house. Trenches, Gacy said, were for a drainage system. Multiple young men, over multiple years, walked into that house and did not walk out, and the machinery that should have caught it did not catch it, until Elizabeth Peist refused to go home from a pharmacy parking lot. The lesson investigators took from Gacy, and it is a lesson that quietly reshaped how missing persons cases involving young men and runaways are handled in the United States, is that a victim being poor or gay or a teenager far from home or already estranged from family is not a reason to look less carefully. It is a reason to look harder, because in this case, for years, no one did. If this case stayed with you, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe to Dark Cases and turn on the bell. Next week, we open another file, and the details in that one are still being argued about in court. We will see you there.